Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome, welcome. Okay. Welcome, everyone. This is the first session of Ethics of Our Fighters, the development of Jewish military ethics with Rabbi Shlomo Brody. Just a few words about the class. What does it mean to fight as a Jew? This question has become acute since the beginning of the Iron Swords War. Civilian casualties, the statutes of international law, hostage negotiations, public diplomacy, and a range of other topics now occupy our water cooler and Shabbat table conversations. What does Judaism have to say about these topics, and what might Jewish history teach us about these quandaries? This series will explore fascinating moments from our past to understand how Jews developed military ethics after many centuries of powerlessness. And we'll discuss great thinkers and figures of the past like Rav Kook, Rav Goren, Rav Yisraeli, and others to see how they helped develop a new area of Jewish law. Like I said, the class is being taught by Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, who is the executive director of Ematai. Am I pronouncing it right? Ematai,
Okay.
an organization dedicated to helping Jews navigate dilemmas regarding end-of-life care, as well as a columnist at the Jerusalem Post. He previously served as the dean of Tikva Online Academy, a rebbe at Yeshivat HaKotel, and research fellow at the Israeli Democracy Institute. Rabbi Brody is also the author of two award-winning books, Ethics of Our Fighters, A Jewish View on War and... Oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay, I thought you were going to say something. A Jewish View on War and Morality, and a guide to the complex contemporary halachic debates. Both are by Magid. His popular writings have appeared on the Wall Street Journal, First Things, City Discourse, and many Jewish publications. Dr. Brody is a graduate of Harvard College. He received rabbinic ordinations from the Israeli Chief Rabbinate, an MA in Jewish philosophy at the Hebrew University, and his PhD from Bar Ilan University Law School. With that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Brody.
Okay, thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you. I'm actually here in Israel, in Modi'in, and it's great to be thinking about these issues, which are all too real, unfortunately, in many different ways. And there's been a lot going on over the last 18 months. I've been thinking about these issues for quite some time, well before October 7th. But my book on the topic of military ethics was sort of ready to be worked on in the summer of 2023, and things got delayed. And in Israel we say "Acharei Chagim," after the holidays. We'll get to it. And October 8th, I called up the people at Magid and say, let's get the book out, and they were able to do it despite the fact that a lot of people are in Miluim. And the past, I guess, 500 days now, we've been talking about these issues at great length, with great amount of depth in terms of trying to think through some of these questions of military ethics. And so I want to try to do in our few sessions together is to explore some of the topics that I talk about in the book, but to take a little bit of a different angle as well. Because in particular, I want to be thinking about not just military ethics, but how military ethics get developed within the context of Jewish law. Because if you think about it, most things in Judaism aren't having to be addressed totally anew, right? In other words, we have precedents for a lot of issues. So, for example, my organization Ematai helps people deal with aging and end-of-life care within Jewish wisdom halacha, and there are precedents, there is texts, there are psakim, there are rulings over the many centuries on those issues. Of course, sometimes it's difficult to apply those teachings to contemporary dilemmas and contemporary technology and whatnot, but we've got a body of work to utilize and to work with. In the case of military ethics, unfortunately, for many centuries, Jews didn't have that type of power. which of course meant we couldn't defend ourselves. It also meant we couldn't defend, though, a whole ethos and ethics of fighting war. And so I want to try to introduce the topic, not just in terms of thinking about what we might say, but how we actually came to develop some of these positions. And to start us off in this first session, I want to take us to what I think is the first genuine debate about Jewish military ethics. That doesn't mean, of course, that there weren't other times when people were talking about it and it doesn't come up, but the first time you see a situation where you have rabbinic leaders and political leaders and philosophers in conversation or in disagreement or in dialogue about what Judaism actually has to say about some of these topics. And to introduce the story, I want to take us back to the year 1937. 1937 is a momentous occasion, of course, in world history. We don't realize what we're headed for in terms of the Holocaust, but the clouds of war, the clouds of conflict are certainly brewing in Europe. The growing anti-Semitism and segregation and other laws against discrimination laws against Jews in Germany, Nazi Germany, already appearing. And we're in 1937 in the midst of what is later known as the Great Arab Revolt. The Great Arab Revolt begins in 1936 when the Arab residents of Mandatory Palestine, which are under British rule, demand that the British leave and stop letting Jews into the land of Israel or Mandatory Palestine. And when the British refuse, the local Arab groups start a revolt against British rule. But it's, of course, a much easier target to target the Jews. And so as we had had in previous eras in 1920, 1921, 1929, from 1936 to 1939, there's the Great Arab Revolt, in which many Jews are killed or wounded by various Arab groups protesting against Jewish presence in mandatory Palestine. But there's a momentous occasion which happens in here. I'm going to share a screen here for a moment, which happens on in the beginning of November of 1937. Well, if you see the headline here, I'll bring the translation momentarily. But this is from one of the local newspapers at the time, Hadavar. 50,000 Jews came to accompany the funeral of 5 workers. These 5 workers have been tilling the fields around Kiryat Anavim, outside of Jerusalem, a little bit past the Mevaseret, and they get killed by anonymous Arab terrorists trying to prevent them from tilling the land. And it creates a big resonates with the Jewish community. And imagine, even today, 50,000 people is a big funeral. But then to have 50,000 people in the whole funeral process is an amazing number of people. This area now is known as Ma'aleh HaChamisha. Ma'aleh HaChamisha in Israel, you may have been to the hotel there, is right next to the area in which these 5 workers are killed. That's why it's called Ma'aleh HaChamisha, commemoration of these 5 that were killed. And so you see that there's a great outpouring of mourning and anger. And Rav Herzog, for example, was the chief rabbi at the time, gets up and gives a declaration and where he says, where are the Muslim leaders protesting against the shedding of innocent blood? And he goes, where's the world, civilized world, who's supposed to be speaking out against such barbaric behavior? What can I say, my friends? Not much has changed. As much as things have changed, not much has changed. And then you have the foreign minister, so to speak, of the Jewish agency, Moshe Shertok, later known as Moshe Sharet, second prime minister of Israel, who gets up and declares that we need to get the British need to provide the Jews with arms for self-defense, and they need to give greater support for our continued work. But he says that our reprisal will be the intensive continuation of our peaceful work, meaning the reprisal that he wants to have are Jews continuing to develop the land, to defend themselves, but no more than that. But as you can see, in the days coming up ahead, other Jews had different ideas. And if you look in the JTA headline just a few days later, and you can see the headline of what's known as the news report from what is Black Sunday, where 6 Arabs and 1 Jew are slain in New Jerusalem disorders. Right? And for the first time, you have a situation where, as an organized group, the group known as the Etzel, the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the breakoff of the Haganah, decides to say that we're going to just attack. And who are they going to attack? Not the people that actually kill the 5 men, because we don't know who they are. So instead, we're just going to kill random Arabs. And they place bombs and grenades, other types of devices in fruit stores and on a bus, Arab bus, and a post office, wherever it might be. And the Jewish community is outraged in many ways. They feel this is politically very bad, but it's also a more fundamentally morally wrong to just kill random Arabs in reprisal for the killing of Jews. And so you can see the Jewish Agency makes a declaration a couple of days later, which is published, in which it says we've withstood the test of this period of bloodshed, and we're going to defend our positions, but also maintain a purity of its arms of defense. Out of moral recognition and political maturity, we need to adhere to the boundaries of self-defense. This is, it seems, the first time that the Jewish community uses the term tarat haneshek, purity of arms, which of course has continued to be a major idea in the ethos of the IDF, and this is where it gets developed. This moment. You want to know where Jewish military ethics get developed? In November 1937 is where an idea of Tarat HaNeshek emerges. But of course, the people who launch the attack in the Etzel also feel that they have something moral to say. And you can see this from the writings of David Raziel. David Raziel was the head of the Etzel. He had briefly learned in the Merkaz of Rabbi Shiva. He was a student of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook. And he describes and says, listen, the way that you can deal with the year and a half of violence against us is only by creating fear on the other side. He who does not want to be defeated has no choice but to attack. He needs to charge his enemy and to break his force and his will. And so you start to see a debate emerging within Jewish circles about what it means to defend yourselves and what means are allowed to defend oneself. And so you remember that Rabbi Herzog had said, Efo Chochmei Dat Islam, where are the Islamic leaders? Well, what does Ben Gurion go now and say? He gets up in a Jewish agency meeting and says, Rabbi Herzog wants to know where are the Islamic leaders. I now want to know Efo Chochmei Dat Yadut, right? Where are the Jewish sages? And what I have here are the ink translation of notes that we have, records of the meeting of the Jewish agency at the time. And Ben Gurion puts up a challenge and says, I want to know what Judaism has to say about this topic. Where are the Jewish leaders? And there's a great rabbinic figure who was a member of the Jewish Agency Executive Council at the time by name of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman, later known as Rabbi Maimon. Okay, Rabbi Maimon, you might recall the famous picture of him or video of him reciting Shechianu, the Brach of Shechianu, when the state is declared a little bit over 10 years later. But at the time, he's just a member of the Jewish Agency Executive Council. Of course, it's not it's far from a conclusion that Israel is going to be created in the first place. And Rabbi Maimon responds and says, listen, we have a great danger that's waiting from us, that from people, if they take the law in their hands, meaning he's against vigilantism. He's very against this idea of break off security groups. But he says, listen, I don't understand. Why aren't we doing what they did? Right? We've been talking about not only Tarat Neshek, period of arms, but of a policy of havlaga, self-restraint. Good term to know, havlaga. And the Etzer is saying we need tkuva, we need a response. And he basically says the havlaga is placing limits on our aliyah. We have to fight back. It is unheard of to ban the blood of our youth who came to build the land. And they went on to say that if he was younger, he too would go out to avenge the spilled blood of the Jews. And they were making our kids to be cowards. And then he goes on to say, well, what about Judaism? And he says, I'll tell you, Judaism is against, of course, the idea of murder and bloodshed, but of the innocent. But of course, in this moment, he says, according to the Rambam, every member of the community from which the criminals come is himself the criminal. We might call collective, that they have some form of collective guilt. And Ben Gurion, as you can imagine, doesn't like that idea one bit. And Ben Gurion, for starters, says, after he said what he said, there's no point in continuing this conversation. But then he says something much more interesting. He says, Rabbi Fishman, Rabbi Maimon, right, wanted to quote the Rambam in defense of the bullies, of the Bironim, but the Rambam never said what Rabbi Fishman said. Why? Because the Rambam could not have said this. He didn't live in our time. He didn't see the Balfour Declaration, the mandate, the situation of the Jews in the diaspora, and the reasons for the Zionist fulfillment in our day. No one knows what the Rambam would say in these circumstances. What is Ben Gurion essentially saying? Rabbi Maimon, you want to invoke precedent from Jewish law, from the Rambam? It's irrelevant because the Rambam statements were given in a totally different political climate, political situation. And you can't just throw out a Rambam and say whatever he said back then applies today as well. And so what Ben Gurion is trying to do is develop a certain Jewish moral ethos, but he's challenging the idea that it can be built on classic halachic text. Okay, very interesting. And what I want to try to do now is to ask, well, can you relate to Jewish text? And to see if we'd have a moral clarification of what would be allowed or not allowed in this circumstance. Right? So I want to now go through a bit of some of the responses that emerges from different rabbinic figures of the time. Let's take a look, for example, in the writings of the chief rabbis of the time. So you have here Rabbi Herzog and Rabbi Yaakov Meir. Rabbi Yaakov Meir is the Sephardic chief rabbi. Rabbi Herzog is the Ashkenazic chief rabbi. And at this period, Rabbi Herzog gets up and says, right, God forbid that any person in Israel should learn from the path of the ways of the Gentiles. Sorry, makes the screen a little bit smaller. Meaning, what's he saying? Or are they saying, excuse me? This is so terrible. And God forbid that anyone should learn from the Goyim. God forbid that anyone should think that it's legitimate to shed innocent blood. Because remember, no one on the Etzel thinks that the people that they were attacking is necessarily involved in the terror attacks on the Jews. And yet, nonetheless, they're being killed. So the question is, well, what's the justification for that? And Rabbi Herzog says, this is the ways of the Goyim. And our greatness, in contrast, is to keep our hands clean from such cruel abominations, even the most difficult and bitter of times. No one should profane Jewish morality. So this is from the chief rabbis, but I think the most adamant opponent to the Tguva response of the Etzel came from the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, Rabbi Amiel. Moshe Avigdor Amiel. Anyone here ever hear of him? A very interesting figure, lived in Tel Aviv, chief rabbi then. He had beat out, they had elections for the chief rabbinate of Tel Aviv 2 or 3 years earlier. And the other two candidates were Rabbi Herzog and Rabbi Soloveitchik. One time Rabbi Soloveitchik comes to the land of Israel. It's in 1935. He tries to run to be chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and he loses. He loses the vote to Rabbi Amiel. Okay? So Rabbi Amiel is an interesting figure. And in a series of drashot and speeches, which he gives in the following year, the following summer, when things have really heated up, he says, listen, this whole idea of self-restraint is a misnomer. It's not because of political calculations that we don't attack back, right? That would imply that it's only because of political reasons. It says no. the reason why we don't attack back and kill innocents is because of this past week's parsha, lo tirtzach. The whole idea of saying that you'd be allowed to kill for innocence for some form of instrumental purpose, he thinks, is just foreign to Judaism. And so he says, lo tirtzach. Why? Because all humans created the image of God. Shavech dam adam damod shafech, right? Whoever sheds human blood by human hands, so that one's blood be shed. And why is that all based on? Because all humans created the image of God. You can't kill random innocents who are created in the image of God. And after all, as we learn in Sefer Yecheskel, ish bechet o yumat. A person shall be put to death for their own sin, but not the sins of their fathers, the sons, their mothers, their daughters, and certainly not their neighbors. Okay, and he's very, very strong to this point and says, listen, the idea of attacking people, killing them randomly, it's like the morality of the nationalism of Bismarck and Hitler. Very strong statement, right? We should never do this. And in fact, Rabbi Herzog comes back and says, people say to him, hey, what are we accomplishing with this policy of self-restraint, of Havlaga? And Rabbi Herzog says, we're accomplishing Kiddush Hashem. We're sanctifying the name of God in the face of the nations of the world. So we see a number of different arguments here of why this is problematic. Lo tirtzach, everyone's creating the image of God. Ish becheto yumat, individual responsibility. Rabbi Amil even invokes the idea of tikkun olam. We're trying in this world to create a better place, and now you're making it harder. And this is a chilul Hashem, it's like a desecration of the name of God from the ways in which people are behaving. Is that compelling? That this is a chilul Hashem? Because in fact, if you look throughout the Tanakh, we do have an idea. It's going to be coming up in a few weeks, partial, that we worry and say, Lama Yomru Hagoyim. What will the nations of the world say? Meaning there are certain types of behaviors in which we care about what the nations of the world say. And it seems actually pretty clear in Shemot, in Yecheskel, other places, the greatest Chilul Hashem isn't just about what they'll say about behavior, it's what they'll say about our political subjugation and being downtrodden. And so you could say that the idea of Kiddush Hashem is quite relevant, but the way in which it's relevant is that we have a Chilul Hashem right now because we have being politically pushed down, being politically defeated. And so what we're starting to see now is some counter arguments. And in fact, it's true that Rabbi Maimon was certainly one of the minority, the vast majority of rabbis at the time. It's important to stress this. The vast majority of rabbis at the time felt strongly that this was wrong. But you recall that Rabbi Maimon had invoked a passage in the Rambam. What passage in the Rambam is he talking about? So it's not about, let's say, the 7 nations or the Amalekite nations. Maybe we'll talk about that next week, right? It's not about those nations because they don't exist anymore. They are no longer on the world. But instead, he's quoting a Rambam in Hilchot Melachim, in which Rambam is trying to explain how the Noahides laws work, the Shiva Mitzvahs V'nei Noach, and in particular uses that to explain why all of the inhabitants of Shechem were killed. You might recall the sons of Yaakov Avinu, Shimon and Levi, decide to free their sister Dinah, who's been taken captive by Hamor in the city of Shechem, right, in the kingdom of Shechem. And so they decide to get her back by killing all of the residents. And the Rambam asked the following question: why was it legitimate to kill everyone? After all, they should have just killed, Hamor and Shechem. And so his answer is it must be that they were all obligated for death because they didn't set up a proper court system. And one of the Shiva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, one of the 7 Noahide laws, is to set up the legitimate court system, dinim. And so this is the answer of the Rambam. Now let's think together for a moment. Is that compelling to think that the reason why Shechem, the city, can be wiped out because they didn't set up all those residents didn't put Shechem and Hamor on trial? I mean, what's the premise? The premise seems to be that the residents of Shechem should have gone out and put their king on trial and the prince on trial. Is that a compelling argument to you? Is that realistic? And moreover, and this is here what the Ramban says, and Rav Shimshon Hirsch says, and others, it's far from clear from the Tanakh that this behavior was condoned. Right? The story is told. We know what they did, but who says what they did was right? Maybe what they did was absolutely wrong. And so you have here an interesting situation because he's sort of selectively choosing the position of the Rambam, when in fact, if you look at others like the Ramban, Nachmanides, you'll see that there is a tremendous amount of condemnation at the end of Sefer Breshit from Yaakov Avinu against the actions of Shimon and Levi. And the Ramban says, right, there just wasn't justification for this. You can't just go and kill people who have done no evil to you. And as Rav Hirsch says, it'd been one thing if they had killed Shechem and Hamor. And perhaps you could even argue it'd be one thing if there was incidental or accidental or non-purposeful killing, as the Maharal seems to say to justify it, because you can argue that perhaps in the nature of war, what is war? It's a collective battle. And sometimes innocents amongst that collective are going to die. But the problem of Shechem and of Shimon and Levi is that they purposely went after everyone. Not that they allowed for the collective identity, but they created a situation of collective guilt and caused people to die. And so, one of the big questions we should think about right now, on a methodological level, is what pushes someone to say, I want to side with the Rambam as opposed to the Ramban? Or I want to side with Rosh Shofar Hirsch, or I want to side with Yaakov over Shimon and Levi. I mean, let's think about it for a moment. This is one of the challenges that we have competing narratives and competing interpretations of those narratives. The Rambam seems to justify their behavior. The Ramban says, no way, Jose. Right now, Rabbi Maimon has another type of argument as well. And this argument, excuse me, it's not just him, but let's go back in contrast to him. That one of the arguments that that is given to explain Yaakov Avinu's fear is to say as follows. Well, maybe the brothers felt one way, but Yaakov Avinu actually felt differently, and we should rule like Yaakov Avinu. And Uziel quotes a very interesting midrash in which we're told that Yaakov Avinu was afraid, right? Vayira Yaakov ma'od. And we're told that he's about to fight Esav, and he's frightened, as Rashi says, based on the Medrash, lest he be killed, and lest he kill others. And everyone asks, wait a minute, why is he afraid of killing others? Those are 400 men coming with Esav that are all coming to kill him. And the answer that is given is that by many is that perhaps those soldiers that came with him came along for the ride, but actually had no intent to do harm to him. Meaning they were there, but they weren't actually actively going to kill him. They're supporting Esav, and nonetheless, he didn't want to kill those that would be attacking him. He was afraid that he would kill them unlawfully. Very, very interesting interpretation, right? Which says that, yes, it might be true that there's a communal identity, and some of those people might be killed, but this is something we should be fearful of causing. Okay. And so for this reason, I think we have this moment in which the vast majority of rabbis establish a principle. And the principle is you don't target non-combatants. Don't target non-combatants. Let's think about this for a moment. How does that sound to you? A principle we don't target non-combatants based on the prohibition of murder, based on all humans were created in the image of God, based on the idea of individual responsibility, ish bechato yumat, based on the idea of kiddush Hashem, based on our ability to go for tikkun olam. Does that make a lot of sense to you? Hopefully, yeah, right. I think we believe that. We don't target non-combatants. And it's actually quite interesting. Rav Goren, who wasn't really around then, but several years later after World War II, has a very powerful statement in which he says that once again, when the issue came up again after World War II, he said as follows: I'm against the murder of Arabs just because they were Arabs. I object to the murder of people who commit no crime against the Jews. And he says, I had many ideological arguments because I was a rabbi and we have a moral standard, the Torah's moral standards, according to which every person is created in God's image. Therefore, I believe we must be merciful and respect every person's life as long as he's not a danger to us and is not fighting us. Okay, and Rav Goren in his Sefer Meshiv Milchama about the laws of war goes on to make a very similar point. Very powerful statement. But let's go ahead there.
Yeah, do you mind if we ask questions?
No, please go ahead. Small group, go ahead.
Yeah, but there's also a difference, isn't there, between Sh Shimon and Levi were the ones who started. Well, actually, they they were provoked, but there wasn't actual war. Whereas with these five Jews who were killed, that I don't know, that's almost like indicates that there was a war already. So to defend yourself, it might be different to have to kill innocents than if you're the one who's going to start the war and kill other people around. Does that make
Well,
sense?
that's interesting. That's an interesting question. But is there any difference if the other side is guilty? Right? Do we still have to care about fighting back morally with restraint? It's obviously a big issue because, according to the argument, you would say as well, in relative times of peace, we have to be careful not to target non-combatants.
Right.
But if we were attacked, we can do whatever we want. Now, you can understand though that once you say that, that's a very dangerous argument. Why? Because everyone thinks they've been wronged and somehow attacked unjustifiably. The Russians say that today the Ukrainians came after our territory, whatever it might be. And then once you say that and say you don't have any restraints, it's very easily justified not having any restraints at all whatsoever. And so the fact that we were attacked by others and they may be guilty, this is separate from the question of not just of why we go to war, but how we go to war. It's a very important principle in ethics. We separate these two.
Yeah,
We
I
would
guess I
justify
meant defense versus offense, but yeah, you're right.
Well, yes, but there might be limits even in defense and even
Right.
in offense. And here is where I think that's interesting. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Because here's where I think it's particularly interesting, which is a statement that Rabbi Amiel makes in the summer of 1938. And he goes and says, if you would tell me that the random killing of Arabs as reprisal attacks would bring about the Geula Shlema, would bring about the final redemption, what would he say about that? Not interested. Not interested. In my opinion, even when we knew for certain that we could bring about the final redemption by indiscriminate killing, we should reject such redemption with two hands and not be redeemed through innocent blood, meaning through killing innocent blood. What year did he say that again? 1938. What was going on in 1938? The clouds of war were clearly hanging over Europe. Zionist leaders were making statements that like the world is divided into two different places. One is a place where no one will let them live, and the other are places where no one will let them come into. Right? Jews are being attacked everywhere. And you have to ask, would there have been a different argument to justify? And here the different argument might have been what is known as supreme emergency. Philosophical literature, we call it supreme emergency. And it's interesting. At the time, one of the great Zionist figures made such an argument, and that's by the name of Ze'ev Jabotinsky. In a famous speech he gives on Tisha B'Av, 1938, he gives the following analogy. Suppose there's a famine in the land, and a miserable man, a wealthy miser, runs by, excuse me, and a miserable man, right, someone who's suffering, who's starving, goes and grabs and steals a loaf of bread from someone who is rich. Innocent or guilty? Are you allowed to steal in a famine? No. Guilty. But Jabotinsky gets up and says, but if you bring this guy to the court of law, what will they say? Not guilty. Why? Because there's a time of famine and the kid is starving. And so he stole a piece of bread from a wealthy person in order to live. That's the mashal. What's the nimshal? That's the analogy. What's he trying to get at? The Jewish people now are in a period of supreme emergency. And Ben Gurion is forced to push back and says to him, it's not just that this is immoral. You've tried doing this now. And as the debate goes on to 1939, you see different stories where people say, you've tried to do it and it hasn't worked. So you can't justify it if it can't even work on practical level. To which, of course, the Etzel and others say in response, it hasn't worked because you guys, the Haganah, aren't doing it with us. But if we took a united front on this issue, well, maybe it would work. Okay, how does this debate get resolved? The answer is World War II breaks out, and everyone sort of decides for their own political purposes not to mess with the British because the British are fighting the Germans, and therefore the debate, the Arab revolt ends, and this debate finishes, at least for them. But I would submit to you that we've learned a lot of principles, a lot of ideas from this debate, which relate to what Jewish military ethics is all about. Because I believe you could argue and say that in this debate, where if you think about it, like what were they trying to do? They didn't have anyone who could clearly tell them what Judaism says on the topic. So they were trying to develop some form of Jewish thinking on the matter. And in fact, if you take a look at this sheet I prepared, you could see, I think, a number of different values that got developed during this time and get put into the principles I call Jewish military ethics. The dignity of mankind, the inherent wrong of illicit bloodshed, individual responsibility, a vision of world, peace, and olam. But yet we understand that there are times when war has to be pursued in the name of justice, to defend oneself, to settle the homeland, to remove evil instincts from your midst. And I think we also understand that war by its nature, as when the questionnaires was asking, is a collective affair. We're going to be partial to our own people. We're going to tell to be brave and courageous. Vayira Yaakov. Yaakov was afraid, but what do we tell him to go do? And then God says, go get ready and fight. And yes, we have to care about Kiddush Hashem, about not desecrating the name of God. But Kiddush Hashem means to not act in an unethical manner, but also not to become a downtrodden people subjugated to mass ridicule. In my mind, this debate actually developed for the first time a Jewish framework for thinking about the topics. And here was where I think it's most interesting, because we're trying to focus on here, and I'll open up for questions and conversation now, is that we're trying to focus here on the whole concept of where do Jewish ethics come from on this issue. But if I would pull up the chart again I just showed you, and I ask you the following, are any of these not Jewish values? Do any of these not have Makorot? No, of course they all have Makorot. Of course they all do. And that being the case, well, what does Judaism have to say on this topic? Because it's not, as Ben Gurion said, that the sources are irrelevant. It's just that the sources are too many. And they speak in different voices. And they might lead us to different conclusions. And that being the case, what good have we done? So here I have a different response, which I think relates to a much more fundamental question about how we form and build Jewish military ethics. And my response is yes, it is true. There are many sources that speak in different voices. And yes, they don't always agree with each other. But as the brilliance of Jewish military ethics, I think it's true about other areas of Jewish ethics as well, but certainly Jewish military ethics, in which we assert that we have multiple values, what I call a multi-framework value framework for making decisions. We're going to have to take all those into consideration, talk to different players, and then strategic players, moral players, and they make decisions in morally complex circumstances. And so, what I actually think that we get developed here is the first time that we have a systematic presentation of Jewish military ethics, which is inchoate, right? It's not really clear, but it's based on values and principles, not clear cut, yes or no, mutter v'aser halachot. So, in my mind, this is really the first moment in which we develop Jewish military ethics for the first time, something which I don't really think was developed beforehand. It just wasn't there. And we now have the opportunity and, of course, responsibility to implement such ethics. And I'll end with one final thought and, of course, open up to questions, which is that I think there's something very powerful about this multi-value framework that we get developed here, because we see that when you think about military ethics, you need to take into account multiple types of values and multiple ideals. And the reason why that's so important to emphasize is that there are many fundamentalists out there in the world. And the fundamentalists, I would define by saying, is people that only care about one value. So you have some people that say all we care about is Jewish victory or Palestinian victory, whatever it might be, and that's all they care about. And you have others, however, who I think we are in that camp, who say, no, you have to bring multiple values to the conversation. Because there's another type of fundamentalism that we also have to combat. And it's not just those who say, all we care about is victory. It's also those who say that there's one value, and that's human rights. Any Canadians in the house today? Good. So if you can go to, let's say, the outgoing, Baruch Hashem, Canadian Prime Minister, Trudeau. So he was a very harsh critic of Israel throughout. And he said he cannot violate human rights. What right do you have to displace people? What right do you have to bomb their homes, etc.? And the answer is, well, yes, that's a morally complex factor, but we have that right because we have an obligation to defend our own people. And that is also a value that has to be brought into play and take a prime role. And so, of course, we care about human rights, but we also care about protecting our citizens, which isn't just a matter of interest, but a matter of moral obligation. And so I think what we end up here is a very important antidote to two types of extremism. One extreme, which more or less says all is fair in love and war, nothing matters, just fight to win. And the other extreme, which says, whoa, you got to first worry about human rights or this or that. Of course, we have to care about those issues. We need to win. We need to care, but we also need to balance these values. And precisely the balancing of the values, I don't mean weigh one up against each another, but to always have those into consideration at given moments is what I think is so powerful about this framework. And I hope and pray that'll serve as an antidote for some of the excessism that we've seen in the past year and a half, 500 days, with regard to thinking about the ethics of war. I'll stop here for now, and let's take some questions or conversation if anyone wants to join in.
Yeah, I had a question because you're saying that there was no I get if I understand correctly that there was no script for wartime. What about David HaMelech? And there were wars before. There was not, they just like wasn't there some strategy or halachically or nothing written down? I mean, I don't know. It just
Great
seems
question. Great question. We have some stories from Tanakh. Let's talk about David Melech. At one point, David Melech wants to prove his worthiness to Shaul, the king Shaul at the time, and he goes into the camps of the other side and just circumcises 300 men on the spot and brings their foreskin to Shaul. As Rabbi Norman Lamb once put it, is that the type of moral reckoning we want to have with war? We could
No.
also say our military ethics should be learned from the Purim story, or for
Right.
wiping out Amalek. That's next week's share, by the way. Meaning, you're absolutely right, Leah, that part of what we have to do here is to say, well, wait a minute. Rabbi Brody, you just quote a lot of interesting values and principles, but why didn't they invoke some of the military fighting that already has gone on? And that's part of the question of you can't develop a Jewish military ethics unless you're going to deal and address that broader issue. Thank you for the question. Anyone else?
Yeah, hey, good morning. This is Miriam. So
Hi,
you had
Mary.
mentioned earlier, hi, you mentioned earlier a really interesting thought, and I was wondering how you would resolve it. And if you did, I didn't catch it, so I'm hoping you'll do it again. So you pointed out, okay, so certainly, many people would agree, we don't want to, target non-combatants. We don't want to, flail about wildly hurting and attacking people. However, you mentioned that there's an idea that by doing this, we can prevent and perhaps even end sooner a war, a la America and Hiroshima. So what would be the rabbinic response to that concept, that by showing that we are powerful, so then they won't attack us and the war will end earlier and we will have peace?
The short answer is chapter 8 of my book. The longer answer, which of course I will get into right now a bit, is to say as follows. I mean, that is actually a consideration. You always want to ask, right, if you, by being so hesitant and so careful, you don't actually fight a war more decisively, which will end faster. I mean, if you even think about the current war, had America given the green light to Israel to have attacked on all sorts of fronts, and maybe the Egyptians would have opened their border, to let women and children take refuge there, and we could have had a much more faster, more decisive battle without our hostages, sort of being starved to death, right, in terrible ways. Would that have been more moral? Maybe a shorter war, less people ending. I think that's ending sooner. I think that that's a fair consideration with the following caveat. It's one thing to fight decisively, it's another thing to fight indiscriminately. I don't think the two are the same. Now, it's possible you can justify Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the bombing, Dresden, whatever it might be, and I have a whole discussion about that. All I'm saying is that I think there's a distinction, though, still that we should try to maintain at least who we're targeting are the people that are trying to fight us and not killing indiscriminately, which of course is complicated when you have enemies like Japan in World War II, like you have enemies today where they literally hide under their own people, right? It gets complicated, but at least as a matter of targeting, I think that's the right approach. Does that answer your question, Marion?
Sorry,
Lost
trouble with
her?
the mute
Okay.
button. I hear that that's your approach, and I honestly pretty much agree with you, but I'm wondering if there was any rabbinic response on it.
I think that part of what Rabbi Maimon wanted to say is that the nature of war is that the innocent are going to be killed with the guilty. And that's just the nature of war. And you got to fight. And part of what the Etza was saying is, listen, the greatest enemy of the Jewish people are those who say we can't fight the way those are fighting against us. But I think that's a hard pill to swallow for us to say that we can just be, attacking indiscriminately, because we do have this very overarching principle that all humans were created in the image of God, and we don't want to shed innocent blood unnecessarily. Now, there can be a lot of justification based on the principles we talked about for collateral damage. Yes, that's true. But in terms of actually targeting, I think it would be problematic. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, I have an issue. This is Amy Sapowith.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I read your book, but I've read it now a little bit while ago, so I don't remember all the details. Not that I would remember, there's so much in there. But what I've been struggling with, I'm not sure I'm going to articulate it quite clearly, is the role of purity in all of this and what it does to the human soul, the Jewish person, where God can be when, when we're in a state of tumah. Like where's the Jewish people given this war? And how do we deal with that, acknowledge it?
Yeah, I mean, even the whole discourse of tahara, purity, that was invoked with taharat neshek feels a bit off to me, to be honest with you. Because I understand why they want to use that term. It's really not the right term. And I'm not sure impurity is the right term either, right? You have a moral, in other words, if you kill because you have no choice, you might become tmeah, impure in war, right? You have contact with the dead. Does that make what you did immoral? I don't think so. Right? The same way that, if we have to do work for the Chevra Kadisha and you become Tameah because you're handling the the dead, does that make you Tameah? Sure. Tameh, sure. But it doesn't mean that you're immoral. So I think in some ways it's like a mixing of terms that's a little bit dangerous in my mind. I don't really like the term Taneshek for that reason.
Yeah. There's also, I see it with regard to one's politics too. Like there's a sense of like having to be pure politically, in your stances. And I feel like that also contributes to this confusion.
Yeah, it's a good point because a lot of times politics is, negotiation between different competing factions and parties and different values and different, especially in a democracy. And you might not feel so pure, but you might think what you're doing is right or the moral thing in that circumstance. And so I think that's a very, very hard position to maintain. And that's why I don't like the idea of this purity idea. I think that purity and morality are not the same types of terms.
Yeah.
It's a great question. Really, I appreciate you bringing it up because when we're thinking about the development of Jewish military ethics, so one of the things that you notice is what terms, what verses, what sources do people invoke? And here they're invoking idea purposely of Tara, purity, but it might be that that's not really the right type of terminology utilized in this circumstance.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, so I think we've hit now the first sort of major moment. But as was asked earlier, you can't develop Jewish military ethics without addressing the biblical legacy. Like what happened to all the Tanakh stories? And there are a lot of different types of Tanakh stories. We get defeated, we get killed, we also do a lot of killing, including of Amalek and the 7 Canaanite nations. How did we reconcile and deal with that? And so next week, please God, we'll have a session thinking about that issue with regard to the development of Jewish military ethics. Because if you can't solve that issue, then what ethics do you have at all? All right. Looking forward to seeing everyone next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Brody, and thank you also to everyone who joined us today and always part of our learning community. Just a reminder that we have this class, 2 more sessions of this class next Tuesday and following, and also we have other classes happening this spring's month. To find information and also sign up for the classes, please go to drisha.org/classes. And for now, להתראות.
Thank you.